Hello, my name is Teresa, and in this video I'm going to talk about 5 drawing fundamentals that really made a difference when I was first starting to draw comics. I hope you find this useful if you're a beginner, and if you're not a beginner, maybe you want to look at the different sections. I have timestamps for them in the comment that I made in the comment section, and you can skip from one to another if you want to. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is proportion. My rule of thumb that I learned after a little while is that proportion goes first, anatomy later. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about the fact that when I started and looking at many people that are starting drawing, there's too much emphasis on anatomy and too little emphasis when it comes to proportion. Now, proportion is key, especially if you consider this. Look at this picture. That is a dog. The anatomy of that dog is perfect. Okay, this is also a dog. The anatomy of this dog is exactly the same, pretty much, as the anatomy of this dog, but it is in the proportions that we see the difference between these two animals. So, I hope you're following me, and if you don't, let's transfer this into human terms. These are humans. These are perfectly anatomically correct humans, but one is a baby on this side, and one is an adult on this side. So as you can see, proportion is what determines how an image reads, not anatomy. You can find several images, especially, well, I don't want to point fingers, but there are some comic book hero artists, especially in the olden days, where the anatomy wasn't, it wasn't correct, but the proportions were right, the perspective was right, and so the image read well. So maybe stop paying so much attention to anatomy at this point and start thinking about proportion. And here's my little pitch of a few things that I found really useful starting. Number 1, adults are between 7 and 8 heads high. What does that mean? Because this can be a little bit confusing at the beginning. Well, let me show you. In classic painting and drawing, you used to have the head as the measure of the body. Why? Because different people are different heights and different people have different proportions. But if you take the head as the, measure, more or less all humans follow the same proportions. So this is one head, okay? And I've done it, the side view. Let me do the front view. That's a head. Boop, boop, boop. There we go. So here we have 2 humans. One is side view, and the other one is a front view. Okay. So when we say that an adult is 7 to 8 heads high or tall, what we're talking about is that if we create the same amount of heads, being this one head, and I'm doing it terribly, of course, 4, 5, 6, let me resize this 1 second, there, and 7, that would be an adult human that would look relatively correct. Okay, so if we go down here and down here, that would be a human that has the correct proportions. Now, this is something that you can reference, and there are many, many charts that show you the ideal proportion of every human being. And this height only applies really to adult humans. But if you follow these guidelines, you will be able to tell where all these sections of the body should be in relation to all the other parts of the body. So this would be like a human with long legs that I'm drawing right now. Okay, and this would be the same human, but in a different view. Bear in mind, this is very cartoony because I'm not gonna do time lapse and perfect drawings for every demonstration. Now, that's the idea. A human is 7 heads tall, and all these elements fall in different sections of these 7 heads or 8 heads. There are models that do 7.5 heads. There are models that do 7 heads. There are models that do 8 heads. I normally do 7.5, but it's reached a point where I don't count anymore and I have more or less an intuitive idea where everything goes. But sometimes I still have to check. Okay, so that's the first point. Second point, human arms, when stretched, reach down to our mid-thighs. Okay, let me show you how that works. So, like the elbow, if you put it down, like I would like you to try with your own body. Your elbow reaches more or less up to here, at least mine does. And then my arm would go all the way down here, and that would be my hand. So you see, this is the place where the arm ends. And this is something you always have to keep in mind. Let's do it again with this guy. That's where it goes, and that's where it goes. Proportions are slightly altered depending on the individual, and they slightly change depending on men or women because, you know, we're slightly different. But whenever you're moving these parts of the body, you always have to keep this proportion, because even if this arm is here, the length is not going to change. And even if this arm is here, the length, again, is not going to change. These lengths and these proportions have to be always kept in mind when we are drawing in order to make the figure read correctly, because you don't want to be drawing a German Shepherd that looks like a corgi, and that's where proportion comes in. Okay. Next thing that I always keep in mind apart from the arms is that each shoulder is about 1 head's width apart from the other head. So let me show you how that works. So we have 1 head. Here. Head. So that's 1 head. That's 2 heads. That's 3 heads. And that is how wide the shoulders should be for an adult. This is the average expected width of the shoulders. Another typical one, space between the eyes is 1 eye. Let me show you how that works. You have your face right here, and then you have 1 eye, 2 eyes, 3 eyes. And there's another rule that says that there should be a 4th and a 5th eye. But generally you have hair covering that area, so I don't know. It's not as useful in my opinion as the idea that you have an eye between every eye. So if you have an eye like this, there should be exactly another eye in there. Now, next one. Playing around with proportions is part of stylization. Now, if we completely ignore what I've been talking about with ideal proportions, then we can start to design characters that truly look different. So if you have those problems of same face syndrome, or you have like same body syndrome and all these things, that you probably have a problem that you're always repeating the same proportions. It's not a question of anything other than that. You don't have to change your style. So if, for example, I want to create a character that looks very thin, I would alter the proportions so that the neck is really thin, the shoulders are really close to the head, basically, hardly no. And if I want to create a super strong character, I would create a head that is maybe 2 heads apart from the shoulders. And that's a completely different body, a completely different proportions, because it is proportions what determine the difference between bodies, not the anatomy. The anatomy is the same for everybody. We all have the same muscles, we all have the same bones, we all have the same parts of our body and organs. It is the proportions that make things look right, wrong, or different. Okay? And finally, the only thing you have to keep in mind is that if you're drawing a comic, regardless of what proportions you choose, because that is your choice as a cartoonist to stylize them in any way you want. For example, if you're drawing chibis, that's absolutely fine, but just make sure that those proportions are kept the same throughout the whole book, because if you're drawing a munchkin one page and the next page you're drawing Superman, then people are going to be confused. So just keep in mind when you're designing your characters which proportions you're going to apply to each character and how that reflects their personality or their physical presence. Okay, so don't start drawing a corgi and end up drawing a German Shepherd because you're paying more attention to anatomy than you're paying to proportion. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Okay, So proportions, super important and super easy. Link in the description to a detailed explanation of human proportions. Now, moving on to my second one, which is form. Okay, form. Sorry. You are not drawing silhouettes, you are not drawing icons, you are drawing form. So this is a misconception that I had at the beginning when I started drawing, and that I think is very common, or I see it happening a lot. So I've put this reference image here, which is a little statue or sculpture of a frog. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I mean. When we begin to draw, what we do a lot of the times is we draw icons. So for example, we want to draw a human and we draw the icon of a human. We draw them like this, well, just the icon of a human. What we're doing is we are basically, because we understand what parts make a human, we are drawing all those different parts, but we are drawing them as symbols, the symbol of a head, of a hand, of a torso, of a leg, but we're not drawing what we actually see, right? So if I were to draw this frog as a iconic frog, as a symbol of a frog, I would probably do something like this. Well, it's difficult. Let me see. I would pay attention to iconic things such as this. I don't know, this is kind of cool. I don't think I'm doing a good job at drawing an iconic frog. No, I'm not drawing an iconic frog. Let me start again. If I want to draw an iconic frog, I would probably draw this. Something like that is what people would draw, okay? And this is the problem I had at the beginning, that I didn't understand that I wasn't drawing silhouettes or icons. I was drawing form. And I remember exactly the moment I understood this. I was trying to copy a Naruto back in the day, a million years ago, and I was trying to draw Naruto's eyes, okay? So I was doing the typical thing that... Let Clip Studio Paint do this thing. Okay, so I was doing the typical thing where I was observing like the outline of the eye, and it was something like this, and I was like, why doesn't it look like Naruto? I don't know. So I was just drawing the silhouette of the eye, okay? And then suddenly it struck me that underneath that eye, underneath that eyelid, there was a sphere, and this sphere was the eye of Naruto. And it was the shape of his skull and the shape of his eyelids what determined how his eyes look. So I started doing this thing where I would go round the eye and I would go round the bottom eye. And I was like, oh, that looks like an actual eye. And I was very surprised about that. So what's happening here is that I started to understand that the things that we see on the surface in a picture are not the reflection of the forms underneath that object. So let me show you what I mean. Let me just erase this. Okay, what I mean is this. If I want to draw this frog, I need to understand that this is not a flat frog. This has volume. And there's a volume going around here. I don't know if you can see it, but this is in front of this. This goes round this, and all this, and this is on top of this. Can you see that? So in these little decisions of what is in front of what is the shape underneath that I'm trying to describe, is in those decisions, in realizing this is here, but this is coming from underneath. That's where you start drawing for real. That's where you leave behind the iconic drawing and drawing silhouettes, and you start to understand form and where do forms come from, what lines go before, in front of the others, what lines do I need to create in order for people to understand the drawing. So you see, that's very different to an icon of a frog. And if I wanted to do it without tracing, I would do something like this. I would understand that there is this top, well, there's this eye that is round, and there's a eyelid that is going round it, and there's the pupil that is also contained within a circle. So I would do something like this, and then I would to this, and behind we have the eye, but that's behind it, so we're going to ignore it a little bit. And then we have this other shape that goes round, but there's a shape coming from underneath. So let me just, and then there's a little smile, but it has to go round. I hope this is clear because it's very clear in my head. And this comes underneath, and this other thing is behind. So you see, the lines that I'm choosing to draw are the lines that describe the relative position of everything, or are trying to indicate the direction, the form, basically. So the lines are not there to describe the outline or the silhouette or to create an icon. The lines are there to indicate to the person viewing the image, what is the form. And if you don't understand the form, then you can't draw. Here we go. Okay, this frog is too fun to draw, so I'm going to stop right now because I think I've made the point clear. And it's in understanding the forms where you will get better at drawing. So forget about silhouettes, forget about lines, and think about form and how to indicate the form in the best possible way. Okay? Okay, moving on to the next one, which is gesture. Now, this is one that I learned fairly recently, and I learned it through a schoolism course that I recommend. If you're in schoolism, go to the Figure Drawing Fundamentals by Alex Wu. Really good course, and it taught me all these things. So I'm not going to go too much into it. I would recommend you go into an in-depth. And also I have a video, which I will link here if you want to go a little bit more in depth in what this whole gesture thing is. But basically what gesture is the ability to put movement in still images. Okay, and the two main things that I want to talk about is line of action, line of action and contrast between lines. So we have uninterrupted and interrupted lines. And this is my own wording, okay? Line of action. Now, this is an example of an older drawing of mine. This is probably 3 years old or something like that. And it's pretty stiff. I mean, not to mention that the proportions are wrong, like the distance between the eyes is too much, etc. But I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to mention how stiff this is and how much I struggled with that before I took the course. And then let's look at this image from an animation. This is a lot more dynamic, if you can see it, but both are still images. So it's not a question of whether this is animation or drawing. This is a drawing, and this is a drawing. This is stiff as heck, and this is very dynamic. And the difference between the two is basically that the Samurai Champloo one has a very clear line of action. Let me show you. We have it here, which is the line that is showing us the motion of getting that sword out, so you can really feel that movement. And the other one is this one, which is again a very clear line, which is showing us how, well, he wasn't called Mugen. I can't remember what he was called, but the samurai, he's grabbing this sword, and this line is really showing us this movement very clearly. And all the lines in the drawing are helping emphasize that line. Whereas in my drawing, there's a lot of lines here that are confusing us. There's just too many lines that are not really contributing to what should have been the focus of this image. Basically, the idea that this character is leaning forward and this character is holding a sword in a defensive way. So I completely missed the mark on this one because I just at the time didn't understand the concept of a line of action, not to mention the tangents, but we're not going to go into that. So now let's look at an example of a reference image here. And let's look at the line of action that I've defined for this image, which is these two lines of action. These are the two movements that I want to focus on. And when you know what you want to focus on, the movement that you want to portray in your image, then you make your lines to emphasize these lines. And you do it in two ways. Number one, by creating actual lines that follow those lines. So for example, if I wanted to emphasize that line, maybe I could create like, I don't know, a kimono maybe that is completely following that line. And in order to emphasize this line going in this direction, which is the movement I'm interested in portraying, maybe I want to be doing some interrupted lines or lines that contrast with it so that the swift movement of this line is emphasized. Okay. And the other motion that I wanted to portray was the fact that this person is leaning back. So maybe I want to do it in one swift move. And again, on the other side, have some crunchy lines, interrupted lines that emphasize the fact that this line is coming that way and it's moving in that direction in a swift way. Obviously, this is a rubbish representation of what this image really shows us very clearly. Because if you look at this image, I mean, how clear is that? You can see that even though kimonos probably don't move that way, they've made the decision in this animation to make this a perfectly straight line. And that is not, a coincidence. That is a choice. And the same happens with this. This kimono wouldn't probably go all the way down in such a straight line, but this is the choice they made to emphasize the fact that this arm is moving in this direction. Okay, so use lines to indicate movement and forget about the details, because if you want to show gesture, those lines need to be clearly indicating the movement. And that is gesture, which is really important for comics to indicate movement. Next one, perspective. Now, I have to admit that perspective is not my cup of tea. It's a very technical aspect and I'm not a very technical person, but I have two things that have really helped me. And here we are. Background before character. This is a very important one. I think adapting a character to a background is far easier than adapting a background to a character. So when I first started making comics, I would draw all the characters and then put the backgrounds, like inserting them, trying to adapt them. And that was really hard because I'm not good at perspective. So wouldn't it make more sense that because the hard part is, drawing the background, which is, here's the bed. Once my bed is correct, then I can very easily place my character on top of that bed because I'm better at drawing humans in different poses than I am at turning rooms and beds around in perspective to fit my characters. So, background before character, because adapting the character to the background is easier than adapting the background to the character. Next. Eye it, design it, then get technical. So what does that mean? Spaces need to be designed, and they need to be designed for the sake of conveying something. So you want to show that this character's room is very gloomy. Okay, so you design that background. Once you have designed it and you have made those decisions, you have to eye it. What do I mean by that? Well, simply the fact that before you set out the grid and get all technical about perspective, you should first have an impression of what is your central element, in this case the bed, because it's a bedroom. So I'm gonna just eye the bed. And this is, not gonna be correct, but here's a bed. I'm just eyeing it, like how more or less it should be, how I think it should be. So here we go. And here's going to be the corner of the room is going to come like this. And there's going to be a window here. And there's going to be a shelf. I'm just completely eyeing these things. Okay, my central element. I decide what my central element is, which is the bed. And then I go, well, in the case of Clip Studio, you have the option of creating a layer rulers, well, like perspective rulers. I place my horizon line above, because if I can see this, and if I can see this, and if I can see that means I'm looking from above. So probably it should be around here. And then I start adapting these lines to what I already know I want, which is this bed. So here's the bed, and I'm going to move everything so that the bed fits in this perspective composition that I'm trying to do here. Whoop. Okay, I think this should be okay. Okay. So that should do it. That's more or less what I want. Then I go up. I make this a little bit less, well, more transparent. And then I start applying the grid and more or less following what I initially decided I would have in the room. So I can now draw things in perspective, following my initial sketch where I was eyeing everything. So see, that's how you do it. You design it, you eye it, and then you apply the technique of the horizon line, the vanishing points, etc. But first have a look at an idea of what you're trying to draw by eyeing it and designing it. Here you have my bed and my window. And now everything is more or less in perspective. Now this is really quick and horrible. I put a lot more care when I'm doing it for my comic. But you know, you can get a pretty decent thingy going. And that's how I do perspective. I eye it, design it, and then I get technical. If you're doing traditionally, obviously you have to get your ruler out, but if you're doing it on Clip Studio, you have this handy tool, which is the perspective layers. Okay? Now, finally, we arrived to the point of something that I think is super, super important, and that's taken me a long time to understand, which is design. Every time you draw a panel and every time you draw a page in a comic, you need to be able to tell what is the main idea I want to communicate in this page or in this panel. And that's, once you know that, that's where design comes in. Let's have a look at 2 examples of designs that are aimed at giving a clear image, like a clear idea of what they're trying to do. Okay, that was terribly explained, but let me show you the picture. Here we have He-Man. Now, this image conveys this idea of power, and they have evil behind that is attacking him, but he's against it, etc. And this reads very quickly and very clearly. Why? Because it's very well designed. Now, let's look at some elements of this image, and I have a list here. So this is giving us an idea of power. And the first thing we notice is that it has a triangular composition. So we have the, oops, I need to, here, there we go. So we have a triangular composition. We have the triangle that is He-Man, and these triangles are repeated all over the composition. We have a lot of triangles, so we get this idea of danger, of violence, the mouth, the sword, and you know, we have this triangle here. So lots of triangles which give the image a lot of cohesion visually. But then, how do we separate the good triangles from the bad triangles? Well, color. The evil that's coming from behind with all these spiky bits is blue and He-Man is red. And so we know that He-Man is in opposition to this thing. And finally, we have the element of focus. So we have speed lines. I don't know if you can see them, but they're all over here. Boop, 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 boop. All over. Pointing where? Pointing to the sword. And where are He-Man's eyes looking? He's looking up towards the sword. And where are all the elements basically pointing in this composition? All the elements, including these lightning bolts, are pointing towards the sword. They are directing our eyes towards the sword because it's the central element of the composition. Because what they want to communicate is like, here's He-Man, here's a really cool sword, it's super powerful. And one of the ways in which our eyes are drawn to the sword is through contrast. This is the only white element in the entire picture. Well, there are some highlights here, but this is certainly a lot whiter, there's a lot more contrast. Now let's look at a contrast of this powerful image. And I think there's a good contrast with this image, which is sadness from Inside Out. Now, this is very different. Now, let's have a look at this. It's very different and at the same time very similar, because we have, instead of triangles, we have an horizontal layering. Okay, we have this layer here, which is lava, then we have the cushion, then we have sadness, and then we have these other layers up top. So it creates this thing where she's in the middle of these layers, like if she was in a sandwich full of pressure and she's just in between being crushed. So it's a completely different idea of these empowering triangles that we had with He-Man. Here we have just this layering and our character here in the middle. So that's the first thing. The composition is very different. Then the color. Again, we have blue and red, but in this situation, blue is our character and red is all these strong, powerful things around her. So this is exactly the opposite to He-Man. He-Man is the red one because he's the powerful one, and the blue one is the evil one. In this case, she is the blue one because she's powerless. Okay, and then finally we have the focus lines, exactly the same as with He-Man. We have the drapery, which is pointing at her. We have this cushion directly pointing at her. We have a lot of elements that are pointing at her. Okay, so again, we have the focus lines, and exactly the same as He-Man, the whitest part is her jumper, and that focuses our eye on our little sadness here. It gives a complete different feeling using same colors and the same techniques. So design is an important element that will help you make your images more effective, and this is very important in comics because what you want to do is you want to create panels that are easily read and that your reader doesn't have to stop and say, what was that? Where did I see this? Etc. You want to guide them into looking at the elements quickly and be able to move on. And well, that is it. We have proportion. We have form, gesture, perspective, design. All these things put together is what has helped me go from where I was at the beginning to where I am now, which is not too far from where I started, but it is something. And I hope that if you're a beginner or if you're someone that hasn't been in contact with these elements too much, this will help you. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below and I will do my best to reply or send you to other videos and can give you more information. And that is it. Those are my 5 fundamentals that are really helpful for comic. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.